So is the outcome, and I've heard this before a few times, Terry, and I'm not an expert, the idea is having green for all year round? Is that the core of what this concept is? And that I assume means you've got grass, which is, or vegetation, which is bringing nutrients down. It's helping to break the soil apart and just constantly doing that. And I think tied in that is is soil carbon, and carbon sequestration into the soil, which I understand is great for the microbes, etc. So is the core of it keeping grass 100% of the year leads to all these other benefits? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, yeah, whether it be grass or whether it be crops, but we've got to keep living plant material on there for as long as there's moisture. And when we don't treat the soil well, our moisture either doesn't get in or doesn't last very long because there's no sponge there. The carbon is the sponge that holds water, and it also cycles nutrients. So what we've got to do in these soils now is rebuild carbon. We've lost a lot of it through overgrazing, overstocking, and over-farming and ploughing over a long period of time. And it hasn't happened overnight. It's taken 100-odd years, 150 years to create that. Fortunately, Mother Nature is very, very forgiving, and we can recreate those soils quite fast, much faster than many people believe. When I was learning about soils half a century ago, we were told that it would take 10,000 years to grow an inch of soil. It's not right. We can actually grow an inch of soil in a matter of a couple of years with the right processes and programs. And that's what we've got to do. We've actually got to start growing soils again. And carbon is the absolute critical component in all of this. And it gets into the soil from the sugars that a plant produces during photosynthesis. And it's the liquid carbon pathway that Christine Jones is so aptly named. And so about 40 to 50% of the sugar that a plant produces during photosynthesis is actually sent down into the root system to feed the soil biology. Then the biology, particularly the mycorrhizal fungi, starts to convert that sugar into a stable form of carbon in the form of glomalin. And glomalin then is what aggregates your soil. So it takes the fine soil particles and pulls them together into aggregates that might be the size of a match head, for example. And when you have a beautifully aggregated soil, then you've got a lot of room in there for air and water. And that lets water in, and it also holds the soil together. So when one of the signs that we have very poor biology in our soils now is we're getting a lot of wind erosion. And wind erosion is caused by the fact that we've got no aggregation. We've got no aggregation because we've got no biology. And we're doing a lot of things to kill biology in our systems. The use of phosphate, the salt-based phosphate fertilisers, for example, takes out 30 to 70% of the mycorrhizal fungi, which is there to feed the plant phosphorus. It's just, and there's so many things that we do. So my view now in terms of healing country, the first thing is firstly do no harm. And that means no harm to soil biology, because without that soil biology, nothing else is going to work.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's what I'm hearing more and more, Terry. It's really, really interesting. And from a practical level around this as well. So it's around this cover you talked about and all those benefits you just talked about then, but it's this predicting and planning forward. It feels like is a key part of this, is that you don't want to overgraze, as you talked about, and you want to get the cattle off. And sometimes you might be taking the livestock off or whatever you're doing sooner than what conventionally we would be thinking about. So it looks like there's a lot of feed just sitting in the paddock. But can you unpack that planning? How do you go about that planning, when to get livestock on and off? I'm assuming there's all these models and techniques you've got to help people work through that thinking.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to the soil and its water holding capacity. So what we've developed over the last 30 years is a very simple water balance model, and we use a grazing chart to work out what's going on in the soil. So essentially, the feed you've got in the paddock today is a result of the last 12 months' rainfall. And in a month's time, it's a result of the last 12 months' rainfall. And in 6 months' time, it's the result of the last 12 months' rainfall. So basically, at the end of every month, you've got 12 months' rainfall behind you. Now, if you're plotting that every month, you will see either a decline or a flattening or an increase in that running total of rainfall. So if you're in a 600 mil rainfall area, for example, and your running total is sitting on 400 mils, then you cannot run the same number of animals that you would have run if you had 600 mils as a running total of rainfall. And the more we degrade the soils, the less we're going to be able to run for the same rainfall. And as we improve those soils and get more carbon in it, the more animals and the more productivity we get for the same rainfall. So the grazing chart actually plots that running total of rainfall, and then it plots it against the running total of livestock carried. So we work in terms of stock days of feed removed over that 12 months. And when you compare stock days of feed removed to stock days per hectare of rainfall over the 12-month period, it's very easy then to compare stocking rate to carrying capacity. So, for example, we use a long-term history to calculate carrying capacity. So let's take New South Wales or Victoria. You might be running 300 or 400 DSE days per hectare per 100 mils of rain, could be your carrying capacity. So the goal then is to run your stocking rate plus or minus 10% around that 400 DDHs per 100 mils. So it's actually it's a predictive tool. We can predict 6 months ahead and say, well, what happens if we get no rainfall? What happens if we get median rainfall? What happens if we get average rainfall? And we can actually predict forward what that soil water balance model is going to look like based on how many animals we've carried for the last 12 months, how much feed's already been consumed. And so if we've got a benchmark carrying capacity that's, say, 400 DSE days per hectare per 100 mils, and I take my stocking rate to 500 DSE days per hectare per 100 mils, I'm now in debt. And that gap above that is a debt taken from the ecosystem. And I'm either using stubble or I'm using feed that I shouldn't be using, that should be there for the ants and the spiders and the insects and the birds and everything else that helps that soil and that ecosystem work. So I'm in debt. It's actually like going into overdraft, and it has to be paid back. A lot of problem for our soils is it never gets paid back. And so what you see happening now in some instances, people are keeping animals on right through this drought and feeding them. So then two things happen. One is your bank balance gets drained, your soil resource gets drained, your people resource gets drained, and you still get low animal production. So you've basically got four primary resources that we've got to look after. And when it comes to drought, my view is that you've got to manage drought so only one of those four resources actually has a cost to it. So there's always a cost in a drought, and that cost is going to be, as an absolute minimum, will be financial. What we've got to do is stop it being an ecological cost. In other words, it drains our landscape and destroys it. We've got to stop it being a cost to livestock so they get poor and die and all of those sort of stupid things. And we don't want it to be a cost to people. We don't want people to be stressed and worried and so on. So a drought will affect your bank balance. But somebody that's managing drought well will restrict that loss in a drought to the bank balance and not sacrifice anything else. And using that grazing chart and that tool of knowing where your carrying capacity is relative to rainfall and knowing what your stocking rate is every day of the year relative to rainfall, and then you can actually manage those two things really well.
It sounds great, and I've got my head around that a bit more. I think the biggest barrier is thinking this is just so complex. But I assume, Terry, once you get stuck into this, it becomes second nature, and it's like anything. You get used to it, and you can work through it more easily.
It is not rocket science. If you sit down for 2 hours, you can work out how to do it. Mm-hmm. You can get software to do it for you. So there's the Maya grazing chart, for example, which does all of these calculations for you. All you've got to do is enter the information on your phone every day about where your animals are and put your rainfall into it and put in any purchases and sales, and you've got all your livestock records, and you're able to plot your stocking rate to your carrying capacity continuously. And that's where we need to get to. Like, to me, I don't know how you would actually manage a livestock property without a grazing chart and do it effectively. You're just guessing if you don't have that, and it's a very, very simple tool.
Well, Terry, I want to move on to, we talked about there with soils around risks, and I think soils are probably a key part of risk mitigation, but in the ag industry you hear about, and in what we talk about, we're getting young people onto farms. People say farming and agriculture is so risky. You've got to be alert to those risks. I would love to unpack in your mind what you think people, what are the risks in farming and agriculture. But I'd love to get your spin on how we can mitigate these risks, and so people can be confidently go into this and say, yeah, of course there are risks in farming, but I know what they are, and I hear in my systems to mitigate those risks. You're never going to get rid of them. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what are those things that a farmer should be on top of to help mitigate, and is that, and I reckon I know what your answer is going to be, but is that centered around soil health as well? But what are the other risks that we should be thinking about as a farmer?
Well, I think there's two risks that relate to soil health, and the other big one, of course, is price fluctuation. So I'll talk about price first, because that's one that most people get hung up on.
Yep.
It's a very, very simple one to address. In any commodity, at any point in time, you know the variation in price received. So it's pretty easy to take the last 10 years, sheep prices, cattle prices, grain prices, whatever it is you're producing, and just plot what the price has been on a monthly basis or whatever you like, weekly, whatever. And what you'll find is that the prices work within a range. So it goes up and down, generally within that range. Sometimes, as we've seen in the last few years with cattle prices and with protein prices generally, we've gone on to another range. But there's a new range established higher than the old one. But it will still be a range. So we know pretty well, like with quite a high degree of certainty, where prices are going to be. They'll be within the high and the low. What you don't know is when they're going to be there. But there's a very, very simple way to protect yourself from that so that you always make a profit. So if let's say your cost of production on wheat, take an example, is $200 a tonne, and the price of wheat falls below $200 a tonne, you're going to lose money. But if your cost of production is $100 a tonne and the price of wheat falls to $150 a tonne, you're still making money. Very, very few farmers can tell me what their cost of production is in cents per kilo of wool, cents per kilo of lamb, cents per kilo of lamb, cents per kilo or dollars per tonne of whatever crop you're growing. You have to know your cost of production, and your cost of production's got to be below that low line and then when the price is high, if you keep your cost of production down there, you're making a lot of money. If your cost of production is below the lowest price you're likely to receive, you will always make money. And that's what it comes down to, is cost of production. And firstly, you've got to know that. You've got to know what drives it. And two things drive it. One is your cost, and the second is production. And what a lot of people focus on is cost without looking at production. And unfortunately, what we've got in agriculture is this production paradigm where people talk about, I cut so much wool, my yield is X tonnes per hectare, my weaning rate's 95%, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we don't talk about is what's the cost to produce that. If, for example, let's say the average production in a district, just to pick a number, might be, if you've got a production focus, you might be aiming for, say, 3 tonne per hectare of a particular crop, right? Um, but if that costs you $250 a hectare to achieve, then there's quite a small margin. If, though, for example, you only produce 2 or 2.5 tonnes of that product per hectare, but it costs you $50 a hectare to produce, you're making a lot more money. But the thing that people focus on is production and not the cost of production.
Mm.
So we've got to change the conversation, or we've got to change the way of thinking and get back in and forget about all the pub talk about yields and all of those things that people talk about. We've got to get back to gross margins. We've got to get back to cost of production. We got a classic example years ago of a bloke growing wheat, and I'm not sure if I got the numbers right, but the analogy would be pretty right. And he grew a crop of wheat for, I think his cost of production was about $19 per hectare. The average cost in the district was $250 a hectare. The average production in his production group was about 2.5 tonnes per hectare. His production was about 2.2 tonnes per hectare. And when they got into their discussion group and started talking, all they talked about was yields. And his yield was lower than everyone else's, so he was sort of poo-hooed a little bit. And he said not one person in that group ever asked him what it cost him to produce that crop. And the interesting thing was the same night after they'd had that discussion group, his agronomist rang him up and said, look, I don't think we need you in our group anymore. Now, if you, to me, that really signifies the idiocy of just focusing on yields instead of looking at cost of production. And I don't think to this day anyone's ever rang him up and asked him how you produce a crop for $19 a hectare. Mm. So we've got to change that paradigm. I think then let's come back to the soil, the other two risks that we've got. The other one is climate, obviously, and rainfall.
Yep.
And that actually comes right back to, if you're grazing, it comes back to a grazing chart. And knowing your stocking rate and carrying capacity and monitoring those two things in relation to rainfall. So if somebody gives me a stocking rate or carrying capacity that's not related to rainfall, I know it's basic BS. All right. So that's how you manage rainfall in a grazing situation. It doesn't matter whether it's sheep or cattle or whatever you're running. In a cropping system, it comes back to soil moisture and being able to monitor how much moisture you've got. Now, one of the things that surprises a lot of people is that the more plants you grow, the more moisture you will store. So there's, if we take a lot of areas where people fallow over summer to store summer rainfall to grow a winter crop, the research actually shows that if you grow an intermediary crop, and it might be just a short one over summer, to get some living production going in that soil and then to give you ground cover for the rest of summer, the yield of the following winter crop goes up. And the biology's improved. The carbon starts to go up. The thing that destroys carbon is fallowing, whether that's a bare where it's ploughed, whether it's a bare chemical fallow, whatever it is, that's what destroys soils. We've got to get out of that paradigm. We've got to start growing crops and growing things continuously. But it's got to be multi-species. The data is showing that if you need a minimum of 6 to 8 species in that fallow period to actually conserve moisture. And it's due to then building carbon and the biology which actually holds some of that moisture. It's counterintuitive to what we've learned. One of the other risks in agriculture then is pests and diseases. Pests and diseases only attack plants that are unhealthy, that have a low Brix level. We know, for example, of most plants, once the Brix level exceeds 12, they're virtually immune to everything. So it's our production systems where we're knocking the biology around. We've got poor soil health. Our plants are not fed properly and fed in the right way. And so they're not balanced. The plant can't balance its own chemistry. So we have high levels of simple sugars and low levels of complex sugars. As our plant complexes its sugars, pests and diseases can't eat it. And there's a very simple reason for that, is that the digestive tract of insects cannot handle complex sugars and higher level carbohydrates. They can only handle low level carbohydrates, or low, simple forms of carbohydrates. So it comes back to immunity in the plant. And that immune system, it's exactly like humans. The microbiome of the soil, the microbiome of the plant protects the plant and the soil from pathogens and from diseases. And our own microbiome protects us from the same things. So if we have a weak microbiome and poor gut health, for example, our immune system is shot and we'll end up with all sorts of pests and diseases. Now, Mother Nature's created pests and diseases to take out stuff which shouldn't be in the ecosystem. Right? So let's face it, the more we work with nature and the more we sort those things out, and particularly get our soil health right, some of those risks would disappear.
Terry, that is brilliant. I have no further questions. That is it. I'll sum up. I think I'll try and sum up what you just said then. The three things here is, and I think about this from a Top Gun farmer trying to convince an investor or a retiring farmer to back them to own a farm. And what we often talk about is pitching and convincing someone that you know what you're talking about. And for me, if someone just summarised what you were talking about then, and that was their ethos as a Top Gun farmer, saying, I know about cost of production and I know how to make money, and I know how to make money even at the worst prices, the commodity prices. 2, I know how to build healthy soil because that's the thing that's going to maintain my moisture levels and increase nutrients and help my plants to grow. And 3, I'm going to have healthy plants, which means I don't have as many inputs to keep them healthy. And like if a farmer could wrap up that as their pitch to an investor or a retiring farmer, I think they'll be on that gives so much confidence that they know what they're talking about, and just seems so powerful and relatively simple as well, Terry. I love it. I haven't heard those risks summarised that way, and the mitigation summarised so simply. Thank you for your attention and for watching this video. Click here or somewhere to watch more of our videos. If you're new here, please do subscribe. We want more of your attention. We want to get you inspired to get onto your farm. Let's get you farming.